dia, bonjour à tous. Hi, everybody. Let's start. Vamos começar. Allons commencer.
Hello, good morning. Let's get started.
Bom dia, boa tarde. Sejam todos e todas muito bem-vindos e
I would
bem-vindas.
like to welcome all of you.
Eu sou Benoît
I am Benoît,
e este é meu sinal na língua brasileira.
and this is my Brazilian Sign Language sign, my symbol in this language. Today,
Provavelmente pessoas cegas que estarão
we will
acompanhando
probably have
essa
blind people
transmissão,
here with us in our transmission,
e por isso vou me inscrever.
and then I will describe myself. I'm a white man.
Sou homem cis.
I'm a cis man.
Atrás de mim tem
Behind me,
parede,
there is a wall
tijolos e tem
with bricks, and there is
a cor azul.
a painting in the
Também,
color blue.
do meu lado esquerdo,
Also, on my left-hand side,
fotografia de
there is a small picture of Sigmund Freud.
Eu sou psicanalista
I'm a psychoanalyst.
e também eu sou o diretor
Also, I am
IIP.
the director of IIP.
No dia de hoje, pela primeira vez, eu
Today,
estou
for the first time, I'm
língua
introducing
brasileira
myself in the Brazilian Sign Language. You can see my part in this language. I would like to say that I feel very thrilled in this moment,
E confesso que estou com
and I confess that I'm a little scared too.
Mas ao mesmo tempo, eu posso dizer
But at the same time, I can tell you that I feel really happy
de receber no dia de hoje
to
palestrante
receive our speaker today, Jamieson Webster.
Mas antes de passar a palavra
But before
Jamieson,
handing the floor to Jamieson, I would like
apresentar duas
to introduce two people to you.
A primeira
The first one
é a Marina.
is Marina.
Seja bem-vinda, Marina.
Welcome, Marina.
Tudo bem com você?
Is everything all right with you?
Marina, eu gostaria de pedir, por gentileza,
Marina, I would like to ask you to
se você
please
poderia se apresentar pouco, né? Quem é você, por favor?
to introduce yourself
E também
briefly, and also
gostaria de pedir que você
I would like to ask you
pouco
to talk a little bit
sobre o que você vai fazer hoje, né?
about what you're going to do today at IIP.
Bom dia, boa tarde.
Good
boa
morning,
noite.
good afternoon,
Não
good
vai ser
evening.
língua de sinais.
And I will not speak in sign
Né,
language.
Benoît?
Right,
Quem
Benoît?
sabe dia.
Maybe one day.
Então, primeiro vou me apresentar, né?
Let me
Sou uma
introduce
mulher
myself, first of all.
cis,
I'm a cis woman. I'm a
cabelos
white woman.
castanhos
I
e
have
pouco grisalhos.
brown and grayish hair.
No
My
tamanho
hair
médio.
is curly in a
Usando uma blusa vermelha,
mid
atrás dela uma
size.
estante com portas em
I'm
madeira.
wearing a red blouse, and behind me there is a wardrobe, a brown wardrobe. I'm wearing the earrings with a wire. I'm speaking from Belo Horizonte, the capital of the state of Minas Gerais, and I see people from all over the world in the chat. It's really a joy to see that. Today, I am part of a team at IIP which coordinates the cartels. If you access our website or on Instagram, you will see a link to come and meet us and bring all your issues. I would like to say that I have graduated in psychology 30 years ago. I graduated here in the city of Belo Horizonte. I am mature in psychoanalysis, but I don't want to be old and losing my mind. I don't want to be locked up in a group. So I did the IIP training course. I was a student in the first team, the first group of students. In the beginning, I thought, well, what can a person with 30 years of experience in the clinic do this training? And I'll tell you, it was wonderful. The IIP training course give me this freshness, and there's a lot of people from different areas, not only in the psychology area. There were people with different levels of experience with the clinic, and it was a very rich exchange. People from all over the world, and also teachers from different parts of the world. So it was a very lively, current, and democratic exchange. The way that IIP works in this online mode provides this bond in terms of friendship and also a work bond. I'm finishing this cycle now, and I'm ready for the new proposals of IIP. And I just opened my horizons. I left Belo Horizonte, which means beautiful horizon, and now I open myself to new horizons. I'm going to help moderating this meeting, and as we listen to the speakers, you're going to see this in the bottom of the Zoom page. You will see Q&A, and you can click this button and write your questions, your comments, and our team will organize themselves, and at the end, we will have some time to read your comments and questions. I wish you all a great meeting. Excellent, Marina. Thank you so much for your talk. This moment, the second person that I would like to introduce to you is my dear Dorothée. And please, Dorothée, remember to introduce yourself. Yes, sure. Good morning to you all. My name is Dorothée. I'm the executive assistant of the International Psychoanalysis Institute. I'm a cis woman. I'm white. My hair is blonde. I have a big earphone. I'd like to just share two pieces of information. We're going to have another event. It's a new event we are developing in the Institute, which means Thinking Lacan. It is a new series of meetings. It is a simple event. We're going to have two guests at each time, two psychoanalysts that will talk about different thinkers, and they will show how they can enrich our studies of Lacan. All the conferences will have simultaneous interpretation in French, Portuguese, English, and Brazilian Sign Language. The first one will happen on the 26th of August. It will be online, and it will be Thinking Lacan with Max Weber. In the chat, my colleague Gabriel already provided the link with all the information, so you can subscribe to this new conference at the end of August. Also, we're going to have a great capacity building training in the third cycle that will start in September, and the subscriptions are really going really well. So people from the four corners of the world are welcome and invited to be with us, to be in our training course. Gabriel and I will be here with open arms to receive you and to answer your questions. I will not take much time anymore. Maybe Benoît would like to say something else. I'd like to thank you very much, Dorothé. And now I would like to invite our dear Jamieson. She's our guest. And wishing you good morning to you, Jamieson. Now the floor is yours. Just a moment, please. As a matter of fact, I'd like to say that you, the psychoanalyst from New York, right? In the US?
Yes.
And I'd like to ask you to please introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jamieson Webster. I'm a psychoanalyst in New York. I teach at the New School for Social Research. I'm on the board of Purcell Psychoanalytic Institute, a founder of Das Unbehagen, which is a psychoanalytic collective here in the US. I'm a half Filipino, half white cis woman, and I'm in my office in Brooklyn, New York. I was very happy to see many people from the Philippines in the chat, which is surprising me. I don't often get to talk to people from my home country. And a couple friends. I saw my supervisee, Zach. I saw my friend Hadi and my amazing research assistant is also here. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the psychosomatic. We have a big title between Winnicott, Freud, and Lacan. The idea of talking about what is the psychosomatic, what is the body, about all three of them today in a short time is a lot. So I'm gonna do it in broad strokes, and then we have a nice opportunity to have a discussion. To begin, I want to present Winnicott. I read this paper recently this year, and it kind of blew my mind. I think it's a really radical, surprising paper. I'm not a Winnicottian, but there's certain moments in which he absolutely astounds me, and this was one of them. So I'm going to share my screen just so we can take a look at it, and then I'm going to go back to sort of broader talk. So he starts this paper, Mind and its Relation to the Psyche Soma, and he quotes Jones from, and this is a paper that was read before the medical section of the British Psychological Society in 1949 and revised in 1953. So this is old. He quotes Jones in the beginning of this paper. Jones says these elements of basically mental, like the sort of mental dynamic aspects that psychoanalysis is interested in, these elements would have a somatic and probably a neurological equivalent. And in that way, we should, by scientific method, have closely narrowed the age-old gap between mind and body. I venture to predict then that the antithesis, which has baffled all the philosophers, will be found to be based on an illusion. In other words, I do not think that the mind really exists as an entity. So this is Jones, and Winnicott says he wants to start with this quote, I do not think that the mind really exists as an entity. And he says that this stimulated him to try to sort out his own ideas on this vast and difficult subject. The body scheme with its temporal and spatial aspects provides a valuable statement of the individual's diagram of himself, and in it, I believe there is no obvious place for the mind. Yet, he says, in clinical practice, we do meet with the mind as an entity localized somewhere by the patient. A further study of the paradox that the mind does not really exist as an entity is therefore necessary. So basically what Winnicott does at this moment is he says, you know, everything that psychoanalysis speaks about seems to relate to what we call psychosomatic, but psychosomatic itself is this clunky, double-headed word, this dash psyche-soma, and that more or less we're speaking about what it means to feel alive in one's body, and that there's the core imaginative, alive self, he says, is this thing we call psyche-soma, which is closer to body. And that what is called mind is a false entity and a false localization. So you can see that. He says, in the study of a developing individual, the mind then will be found to be developing a false entity and a false localization. A study of this abnormal tendency must precede the more direct examination of the mind specialization of the healthy or normal psyche. So this is what I found so surprising. I'm going to stop sharing and just talk with you now. And one of the things that's interesting, I mean, he goes on and he says, well, how does this false mind, false entity get localized and dissociated or subtracted by the given individual? And he says that the world must have impinged on them. It's a kind of basic Winnicottian idea, such that they had to become hypervigilant. They had to subtract something that was basically a hypervigilance over what was forcing its way into them, that didn't allow them to have a sense of continuity with their own bodies. And this mind appears almost as if on the outside. So it's an externalized entity, and they don't quite know where it is, although they think it's in their head, but there's no particular feeling in the head. It's not as if you feel like your mind is in your head. But he was surprised in many, many patients with this false localized entity, otherwise known as mind, that they want to attack their heads. And Winnicott says, why, he's a bit baffled by this. And he goes back to the fact that the infant's head is crushed during childbirth. And he says, this must have been the first experience of anxiety, impingement, and vigilance. Was this experience of the head being crushed. I mean, this made me laugh because it's kind of a wild fantasy, but I like it as a thought experiment. And then on top of this, he says he thinks it's funny that you can't see the back of your head, but there's this moment in terms of being able to see where you see out of your head, but you can't see the back of it. So it's as if they're trying to localize the mind in the place where they see but can't see. So something about this is also very beautiful. I mean, this is, Winnicott sort of speculating wildly at the end about this false localization, but he's sure that when one has a sense of continuity of being in time and space and aliveness, that you don't have this thing called mind. I'm just going to put this out there. Lacan, it's very important for him in seminar 23, the late seminar, that he says, we are a body, we don't have a body. And having a body is an illusion. It's not something that we have. And he also links this to the concentration camp, actually, in which this fantasy of having a body could allow something like the brutality of having other people's bodies, piling up bodies, taking bodies, having them. So again, now you see this false entity called mind, this illusion of having the body as something that you have and you localize and can put within your grasp as something that Lacan at a later point says leads to something very quite violent. So that's the little opening I want to give, and I'm going to go back to some very basic Freud because I want to think about how Freud starts to talk about this thing that he calls the psychosomatic. To begin, I was really surprised by a recent mention of conversion hysteria, which is the first way that I want to approach the question of psyche-soma in Freud, because it's the way that it appears, I think, the most readily in his early kind of building up of his metapsychology, in which the hysteric is the psychosomatic figure. And this came up in an article by Jacqueline Rose in the 100th anniversary of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in the London Review of Books. And in this paper, she goes back to Freud's discarded paper, A Phylogenetic Fantasy, because in it she found something that spoke to her about our current moment, sort of pandemic, still within the auspices of the pandemic, because Freud locates the origin of conversion hysteria, like the first psychosomatic figure or the first neurotic figure who shows us something about the psychosomatic, in what he called the Ice Age. So he says, at the point that there was the Ice Age, something happened to man. He got threatened by the outside, same way like the baby whose head was being crushed. Something threatened us, and he says that we had to turn against ourselves. Man, he says, turned into an anxious animal, and faced with this emergency, man imposed on himself a ban on reproduction, and because it would not have been safe in the conditions under the Ice Age. And thus, man gave up on immortality. Because we are not bacteria, we don't immortally produce out of ourselves. For us, in sexed reproduction, which subjects us to death, the only access to immortality is through reproduction. And the first response to this curtailing of the drive and the drive to potentially reproduce or seek immortality, he says, is conversion hysteria. So Jacqueline Rose writes, man's response to a brute curtailing of his drives was hysteria. The origins of conversion hysteria in modern times, in which the libido is a danger to be subdued. Man also, however, becomes a tyrant, bestowing on himself unrestrained dominance as a reward for his powers to safeguard the lives of many. She quotes Freud. He says, language was magic to him. His thoughts seemed omnipotent to him. He understood the world according to his ego. So it's interesting because in a way you have anxiety, which turns into conversion hysteria, which then turns into this figure of the tyrant, which is also Freud's label of obsessionality, moving towards paranoia. And this is the person who becomes mind. If you read the Freud, there's something about it that is this figure who's all mind and who believes in the magical powers of the mind. So Freud's series that he elaborates in the phylogenetic fantasy is first anxiety hysteria, then conversion hysteria, then obsessionality, then schizophrenia, paranoia, and melancholia mania. All right, so I wanted you to keep this series in mind. It's very important, not really for discrete psychopathologies, but to play with what in this amazing paper of Freud's is about layers of history and their place as bodily panic, bodily symptomatic reactions, the move away from the libido. And then you have group psychology, the elision of the body into mind, into tyrant, into tyranny, magical thinking, and paranoia. I mean, this is really what Freud sets out in this phylogenetic fantasy, which he burned. So he didn't want us to read it. He thought, I don't know, it was too wild. It was too speculative. Maybe it was too true. All right, so let's think a little bit more about hysteria. Freud says about hysteria very early on that in this way that it preserves something, it preserves the reaction to the external environment, but also subdues the anxiety that was impossible to live with. That the body is not available to a natural process of erosion, wearing away, draining, leveling, and emptying out. Something is preserved in the body that he says is kind of like a sounding board And that to the outside, it seems to people that what is in there that won't give way is out of proportion. It's disproportionate. This is a judgment from the outside, but of course the psychoanalyst understands that the reaction is legitimate with respect to what it's reacting to. It's just not the things in reality, it's something on the inside. As Freud begins to talk about the hysteric, he says, interestingly, that the goal then, which is not to necessarily adapt the hysteric to the outside world, but to get closer to what it is that she's preserved on the inside. What was the original, what was it that she originarily reacted to, the Ice Age? The goal is not the removal of this pathogenic core, which defines her, but a new state altogether. This was very important to me in a book, 2 books ago, that I wrote, Conversion Disorder, because I found what I thought was the greatest tautology in psychoanalysis, that he says conversion must be subject to conversion. What's interesting to Freud is that the conversion symptom, this kind of like bodily symptom, it won't quit. It stays there. It stays there in its reactive state and its refusal to drain itself away. But in hiding itself away, it has quit. Right? It's quit living in relationship to reality. It stays on the inside, and it insists. And he says what it does is that it leaves the psychical sphere, the psychosomatic kind of entity intact, but it does split the subject. It makes a detour, he says, into soma in order to better insist there, while somehow leaving something about subjectivity separated off but intact. So when Freud compares hysteria to anxiety, or even to obsessionality, what is clear to him is that the somopsyche in conversion is the purest symptom. It's the true symptom. Because anxiety has no symptom. It's just anxiety. It's a breakout of, oh my God, what's going to happen in the world? Conversion hysteria does something with it. What happens in obsessionality is a transformation that he says is not true. It's somehow this mind symptom of Winnicott's is a problem. I'm going to get into this in a second. He says basically that the mind as a symptom is a failure of actual transformation, especially insofar as the defensive structure is simply too permanent. He has a very funny way of putting it. He says that what is the subject is rather undefined. It's a kind of medial zone of incessive defense and substitution, projection and hallucination, what he eventually calls an unending series of half measures. This is basically what he's saying about everything in the series that we read in the phylogenetic fantasies that follows conversion hysteria. So somehow you have the true symptom and then everything afterwards, which is this incessant defense and substitution, projection, hallucination, an unending series of half measures. Freud also writes about the difference between anxiety and hysteria to Fleece in his letters that he was working on at the same time that he was developing what he called his neurotica. He says, this is a quote, "If the symptoms of anxiety are examined more closely, one finds in neurosis disjointed pieces of a major anxiety attack. This is once again the kind of conversion in anxiety, just as occurs in hysteria, but in hysteria, it is psychic excitation that takes a wrong path exclusively into the somatic field, whereas here it is just pure physical tension, which cannot enter the psychic field and therefore remains on the physical path." Hysterical conversion, then, is the reverse face of anxiety conversion. The first moves from the psychic to the somatic. That's what hysteria does. The latter is a failed movement from the somatic to the psychic. This is the basis of much of what the psychosomatic school of thought, for example, in French, works on, which they call unmentalized experience in anxiety. This idea that the patient comes, and it's not that they have a mind, They don't have any mind. They're almost pure body. So you have mind on the one hand, you have almost pure body on the other, and then you have the conversion hysteric in the middle, which he's calling the true symptom or the true psychosomatic picture. Right? I mean, this is a very strange mapping that Freud's giving that I want you guys to wrap your head around. A few letters later, Freud summarizes these findings graphically. I'm not going to show you the graph. And what he says about hysteria is that it's the only diagnosis with a satisfactory gain, meaning the gain of the symptom, but an unstable defense structure. Right? So anxiety has no gain. It can't coalesce into a symptom, into repression, into something that can make it somewhere. On the other hand, the mind figure, the obsessional or psychotic figure, is an impossible defensive structure. Too defensive. So the hysteric is a satisfactory gain with an unstable defensive structure. So this stable instability of the economics of the conversion hysteric are a structure that he says act like a sounding board to a tuning fork that can transform into the space of psychoanalysis. This is the psychoanalytic destiny of the psychosomatic figure. So this parasite, this bodily parasite on the inside, he says, spreads out into the space of analysis. And this is what he means in the very early days of studies in hysteria, when he says that the symptom joins the conversation, takes over the rhythm of analysis, seems to structure the peaks and dips and associations and unfolding of the entire analytic process. So, and he actually calls the psychoanalytic process at that point the architecture of hysteria. So I really love this, right? This model where on the one hand you have this figure that's pure body, on the other hand you have this problem of pure mind, and you have this psychosoma of the conversion hysteric that is actually what makes the psychoanalytic process possible, as if the psychosomatic transforms into the rhythm, space, and architecture of analysis itself. So hysteria assumes this amazing place of prominence, but fascinatingly, it actually at a certain moment in Freud's life becomes completely scotomized. In his work in 1926, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, Freud basically says that the question of conversion, this kind of this creation, this gain, this symptom formation, this possibility, this capacity, this aptitude that the hysteric has is too mysterious. He says, I cannot wrap my head around how it's possible. I wanted to understand this. I can't understand it. I have to quit trying to understand this without delay. I'm going to turn my mind to the problems of anxiety and inhibition. So it's a funny moment. I mean, it's a funny moment in which Freud really kind of gives up on hysteria, even though it had formed the core of his work and of his metapsychological system. And it's as if he was really angry about what he couldn't know about it. And it's as if he's also frustrated with the idea of what in it is almost a pure creation in and of itself. So I got very interested in this moment that he's like, basta. And, we know that Freud, wrote about studies in hysteria. He wrote about Dora, but he didn't quite return to it. I would say that Lacan does a lot of the work here that Freud drops the ball on. Although, Freud and Lacan themselves, a lot of their technical innovations have to do with dealing with anxiety and obsessionality, because something about hysteric lent itself to the pure symptom, the pure analysis, right? And it was much more difficult to figure out how to bring these other figures towards the hysteria that would make analysis possible. So I'm just pointing to this as a funny historical moment where what defines psychoanalysis also gets kind of moved away from. And it is important in terms of what we have to work on, I think, clinically, but it's also something that I think gets, sort of freaks us out. All right, there's one thing that I want to say about this. I know that we really do want to get to the discussion. There's a beautiful graph that I want to show you that Freud also uses at this point in time that I'm just going to show you quickly. Share, this is his schematic diagram of sexuality. And I got really interested in this graph because there's something very beautiful, which is that the sexual object is completely collapsed with the external world. Like, they only exist, the two exist for us together. And the importance to keep this whole psychosomatic figure going is that the sexual object come back in not as a mental event, but the sexual object in a favorable position to provide the sensations on the level of the body that can, become something up here that's called psychical groupings and enter back into the external world. So you have this almost beautiful Mobius-like figure, it's very Lacanian, that keeps traversing this psychosomatic boundary. And it does so via the refinding of the sexual object in Freud. And I just, also here you can see, like, when he spoke about this graph with respect to anxiety, what he was pissed off on is that the in this column right here, this conduction of voluptuous feelings, it couldn't reach whatever psychical grouping would need to be there in order to find something, to create an object in the external world. Right. And I suppose, I have never done it, you could read the figure of mind back into this as the person who has no relation to the sexual object that can have a libidinal character to it. Right. So you can see the kind of the difficulties of those two figures and the Mobius-like trajectory that he's looking for in the psychosomatic figure. So I had wanted to say some things about Kristeva, but I'm actually going to leave it. Maybe it'll come up for us in the discussion, and I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. I don't have the translation from Benoît.
Yeah, there's not the translation. Marcelo, onde você está? Bruna, você pode me traduzir?
Bruna,
não?
could you please translate me?
Tanto faz. Marina, tem perguntas.
Marina, there are questions. Jamieson, thank you so much. You were able to have a quick talk, but extremely stimulating and interesting. I really enjoyed it. Marina, do we have questions and comments? Yes, we have a few questions. Just to remind you, folks, you can send your questions, or if you prefer, you can ask your question using your microphone or using the Brazilian Sign Language. We also have interpreters for that, and then we can alternate. There's a question from Priscilla. Can we say that Reich provided relevant contributions for the understanding of body-mind as things that are integrated? So he's talking about the corporal psychology, William Reich, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually reading right this minute a book called Adventures in the Orgasmatron. It's a beautiful book, actually. It's a popular book that was written about the history of Wilhelm Reich. the phrase that came to mind is that everyone in the Reichian world was stuck in the land of fuck. Sorry. But there's an important difference here, which is that, you know, Reich thought that, I don't know, the perfect orgasm, the perfect fuck was gonna solve your problems. And this is not what for me, I'm elaborating according to Freud, Winnicott, and Lacan. And the symptom, your symptom implies a loss of libido that you're not going to get back. Reich thought, you know, we get rid of all symptoms, we attack all symptoms. I think the Freudian Lacanian point is that the symptom, which is the hit that we all take on the level of our libido, is already a transformation that's very important that you need to learn to live with. It is the source of a possible creativity. It is the source of a libidinal intensity, but it's not the land of fuck. You know, that being said, there's a lot in Reich that's really interesting, that I'm very interested in. But you know, you have to see where it went. I think it's really important that you have to see where Reich went. And I mean, he went crazy. He really did. I mean, he thought that he could see the energy of the body everywhere. It was emanating. The blue light that was coming out of the skin. And it was a promise of all. You would get the totality of your body. You would get the totality of the orgasm. You would get all. And I think psychoanalysis can't promise that.
Bom, então vamos para a próxima.
Well, let's move on to the next question because we have a long list of questions. So Jesus asked a question in English. He's asked, how does the psychosomatic appear in our daily life? And maybe there's another question that we can put together with this one. When you talk about anxiety, can we read this with the same meaning as anguish or angst?
These are good questions. I think importantly, the psychosomatic, we see it all the time as clinicians. We see it in infantile sexuality. We see it in the complaints of the patients, whether it's about their sexuality, whether it's about the way their bodies or the images of their bodies nag them. It's eating, it's shitting, it's sexuality. So it's really strong still. And, you know, of course, we also see it in illnesses that are mysterious, whether it's autoimmune issues, whether it's chronic pain, chronic fatigue, chronic Lyme's disease. I mean, there's something about the difficulties that the body poses to the patient that are always immediately there. And the psychosexuality that is difficult to work with. So I feel like it's really important. I feel like, you know, we pay a lot of attention to this, especially in the histories that we take with our patients very early on. You know, what happened when you were 3? What happened to you when you were 5? You know, what were the first times that you got very, very sick? What was happening around? You know, we do a very careful kind of sense of this, but then it's important that, you know, as I was saying, the psychosomatic symptom, if we are in a place where we're closer to it, the quote unquote hystericization of the patient, it has to be, it becomes the basis of the analysis itself. It joins into the analysis. So there's not a moment anymore where you're tracking this, though you will see it. You will see their symptoms start to unfold, transform, appear, disappear, reappear. And then this is the stuff of the unfolding of analysis. So there's the, let's say, introductory sessions, beginning period of analysis, where you're getting a history, because it's important for you to have it in mind, but then the analysis takes place. And as for anxiety, I mean, there's something important here, which is the difference between a patient who complains about anxiety, which is very diffuse. You know, I mean, if we want to be DSM-y about it, it's what is generalized anxiety disorder. All they talk about is what makes them anxious. This is very different from someone who starts to localize it around the question of a symptom over time or a bodily difficulty over time that really feels more like theirs than the anxiety does, which is on the outside in a way. All, you know, all the stuff that makes them upset. So this is why anxiety is so hard to treat. You don't have something that is part of the person that you address yet.
Sim, sim. Então,
Yes, so from Diego, he asks, what to think about the following phrase? The self is an hallucinatory instance.
I like it. It's very close to Winnicott. No, it's close to Winnicott, and it's this moment also, I think, in Freud when he's talking about the obsessionality, or when Jacqueline Rose is talking about the tyrant, or the tyrannical belief in the power of the mind. So you have a really nice, you know, and this, Lacan is in the title of the talk, but he's there in a way hovering in the background. You have this question of what it means to not be psychosomatic, which is to be, in a way, in the hallucination of the self.
Gabriela.
So Gabriela asks, she asks two questions. How can hysteria consist in a gain in the diagnosis, in a diagnostic gain? And so how is hysteria a gain? And she's also curious about your mention to Kristeva. If you could talk a little bit more about her. Thank you.
Thank you. No, the gain is the symptom. The gain, according to Freud, is the symptom that really puts something to work. And, you know, there will always be defenses. We're defensive, but they're unstable. This is what drives people crazy. You know, you can be emotionally reactive 1 minute and then have a bodily paralysis the next minute, and anorexia, and then you know, I don't know, sexual anesthesia. You know, it is all, it's like the defenses are all over the place. Scotomization, you know, and versus this hallucinatory construction of the self, which is very strong. And to be anxious is also very strong. But the symptom, the elevation of it as a force of creation is what he says is the gain. And this actually gets me to the Kristeva, because, you know, people have accused Kristeva of being like making Lacan religious in a sense. And I don't mind it, because I think she takes up what Freud drops the ball on. He says, I'm interested in creation, or I'm terrified of the creation aspect of the symptom. And Kristeva wants to pick this up. She wants to pick this up. And in her book, Black Sun, on depression, she says that there are people who live in a kind of mystical immanence and are unguarded by pain, unguarded with respect to pain. And she says, then there are the melancholics who try to master pain through their constant turning everything into representation. I mean, it's also why they also write well. But she says one is very, very defensive in terms of trying to master pain through endless wordsmithing, or endless creating different ways of managing pain. And the other one is unarmed, living in the kind of immanence of the world. And that what she says is what we need in difficult times like now is neither a return to immanence, Reichian fantasy, nor kind of melancholic obsessionality, but to create. And all of her interests in certain forms of feminine literature or poetry or the special kinds of creation and analysis that find the places where language is doing something very fascinating, or the symptom is doing something incredibly fascinating, is what she says we need to zero in on. And because it is this mysterious world of creation. So I think she takes up the running there that Freud dropped, like a good hysteric.
Sim. Ó, para a gente aproveitar o tempo. Agora
So I need to take advantage of the last few minutes. I'm going to gather 3 questions here. So we have, I'd like to better understand the relationship of the graph that you showed about sexuality with the psychosomatic. Corina wanted a clinical point of view, and how do you work in your office? And Beatriz asks you for book references about the psychosomatic and patients with chronic pain.
You know, there's a wonderful book by Darian Leader called What Makes Us Ill that he wrote with a physician. It's old. And I don't think anyone read it. He didn't write it for psychoanalysts. He wrote it for the public, but it's really good. It's really, really good. So I would recommend that. And I love all this kind of early Freud that I've been presenting. So if you go back to him, there's something really extraordinary because it's in the letters to Fleece, it's in the neuropsychoses of defense, in which he kind of lays out his diagnostic system. It's in like the phylogenetic fantasies paper. So to kind of take a look at this, and I know I was so quick with this graph, but it's very beautiful. It's in the letters to Fleece. It's in relationship to him, again, talking interestingly about melancholia. And Freud's really trying to work something out that I don't think changed throughout his, what he did in those early days does not change much in terms of what he has to say about the disposition to anxiety, hysteria, obsessionality, and then the psychoses. He changes importantly his theory of anxiety. He thought that anxiety was the result of defenses. And in 1926, he says it's not the result of defenses, it's the result of the failure of a defense to create a symptom. So he refines that at that point. And the graph was it's funny because the graph comes up when he's speaking about melancholia, and he's trying to locate the way that any of these structures entails a certain loss on the level of the body, but some losses become too extreme. So anxiety, which is something's trapped in the body and can't find any way to become anything else than the hyperarousal, basically, of the body, which we know now scientifically. You know, we see the autonomic arousal, we see the heart palpitations, we see that this system can't shut off in terms of what is happening to an anxious person. But he says eventually this is going to create serious blows to a person's libidinal constitution. And he says it will eventually open out into depression. And by depression, he then means a system that can't support itself. He says the depression is the pain of a container with no bottom. So as if the system that had been doing this then just starts to bleed out. So this graph is an attempt to see how the entire structure can support itself. And my claim, it's not my claim, I just think it's basic Freudianism, is that it's the hysterical creation of the system that keeps a movement between the internal and the external world going. The other side of this is the possibility that you try to stack the thing in the relationship of the defensive structure of mind, which we know on the extreme end of psychosis, which is a pure paranoid fantasy and of the world, a pure putting of mind onto the world, which ironically becomes a picture of the body, right? So all of the whatever the alien rays out there that are, you know, I don't know, the rays of the sun that are going in your anus, Schreber's style is an image of the libidinal body. That's gone mad, that can't support itself. So I really love this, and I think that it's foundational to psychoanalysis. So what is psychosomatic? This is the impossibility. We have a 20-minute talk and a little bit of discussion to say what is the everything. But not in the Reichian sense of the land of fuck.
Então, muito obrigada. Ficaram
Well,
muito
thank you so much. There are so many other questions here, but Benoît is going to speak now. The questions will live on in time.
Muito obrigado,
Thank you very much.
Jamieson. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Jameson, for your excellent lesson. Thank you. Congratulations.
Novamente eu queria agradecer
So once more, I'd like to thank
intérpretes,
the
tradutores,
interpreter
muito
team,
obrigado pelo trabalho de vocês.
the translation team. Thank you so much for your work.
E queria desejar
And I'd also
beijo para todo mundo, excelente final de semana para todos.
give you all hugs and kisses and an excellent weekend for all of you. Bye bye.
Thank you.